Just a disclaimer to start. Please note I am not a licensed financial advisor or registered investment advisor. Any and all of the information provided or otherwise made available to you is for informational and educational purposes only. None of it is financial or investment advice, and none of it shall be construed to be financial or investment advice. To the extent that I share any viewpoint, it's just my opinion and subject to error, inaccuracy, and inconsistency. I am fallible. I do not guarantee any particular outcome. Please do your own research and decide for yourselves. Thanks. Hi guys, this is part 2 of my videos about Constellation Dag. The first part was about the technology itself. So if you haven't seen that, you should go back and watch it before watching this video. This is part 2, and it's about the tokenomics of Dag. So I'm going to start with delving into the theoretical framework on which the Dag tokenomics is built, and that's called Generative Economics. This was a philosophy or theory invented by Marjorie Kelly. A generative economy is a living economy that is designed to generate the conditions for life to thrive, an economy with an inbuilt tendency to be socially fair, ecologically sustainable. So obviously this isn't confined to technology or digital goods or services. This is a general theory of economics, and it has a sort of ecological bent. It is about how an economy should be structured or is naturally structured with the primary precept or goal of sustaining life, okay? So there are a few different examples of these types of economies: cooperatives, employee-owned businesses, credit unions. All of these are generative economies in their own right, or you could call them microcosms of generative economies. And all of them have this goal of creating fair outcomes and sustainable social and economic structures. Generative economics is meant to contrast with sort of the extractive financial model that fueled nations through industrialization. So it's characterized as a post-industrial philosophy. You can think of it in biological terms as the difference between a parasite and an organism. An organism exists in a symbiotic relationship with their environment, and they change their environment and support their environment and operate in symbiosis, which is a sort of mutually beneficial coupling. A parasite is something that just basically preys on their host and sucks the life from their host. And so generative economies are more like organisms symbiotically coupling with their environments. This might sound very green, very environmental, but actually this notion of symbiotic relationship between man and machine is quite old and has quite an interesting pedigree. J.C.R. Licklider is one of the inventors of the internet, and he wrote a book entitled Man-Computer Symbiosis about how man and machine could approach this sort of apotheosis coupling, which was mutually beneficial for both, where man would have his intellect and performance improved through coupling with machines. So this type of notion is not alien to the technological context. So a good way of understanding how generative economies would work in a blockchain context is looking at some of the comparisons. Traditional blockchain economies are not generative economies. To understand why this is so, we can look at what Wyatt writes in the white paper. He explains how traditional blockchain economies work. So in general, a cryptocurrency is a commodification of the utility provided by a distributed consensus protocol. For most cryptocurrencies, that utility is an atomic update to an immutable append-only log, yielding a tamper-proof record of the network state. So here, Wyatt is describing how traditional blockchains are linear and how the currencies are valued in terms of those data structures, right? Because the currencies represent the value of what the ledger does, and what these ledgers do is just an immutable append-only record of the transactions that take place within them. And so the utility of traditional DLTs is quite limited because of the structure of blockchains. And this is problematic because the structure of these traditional blockchains is actually an artificial constraint, because blockchains are decentralized, and decentralized records are really distributed systems, right? Like That's the most natural structure for a decentralized ledger. But instead, what we have is blockchains that are decentralized, but you cannot parse the workload out amongst all these nodes. And it's an incongruous sort of thing to have a decentralized ledger that adopts that data structure. And so what Wyatt is getting at here is that it's more natural to sheds these artificial constraints and intrinsic limitations so that the value of the currency is no longer bound by them. So I want to here emphasize that there is no intrinsic connection between many blockchain currencies and the activity that takes place on those blockchains, right? The economic activity on the ledgers is largely independent of the value of the coins, okay? So take, for example, Ethereum. Ethereum, when you're charged transaction fees, it's really just a measure of how in demand the network is. And in a sense, that is a proxy for the value of the activities that are being conducted on the Ethereum network. But there is no intrinsic connection between those activities and the value of ETH. Okay? There is no sort of necessary connection between the value of ETH and those activities. So you can be selling an NFT on the Ethereum network for millions of dollars. That isn't going to increase the value of ETH itself. There's a sort of relative independence between the economic activities on the Ethereum network, the value of ETH, right? And that's bad if you're an investor in ETH, because you want ETH to increase in value in a way that corresponds to the value of the activities that are taking place on the network. But that doesn't happen. In fact, on Ethereum, you can mint ERC20 tokens, and it doesn't cost anything to do so. You don't have to stake a certain amount of ETH in order to do that. If you did, then there will be an inherent connection between whatever the value of that token turns out to be and the ETH that it required to create that. And that's what DAG does. The value of DAG is internally or intrinsically related to the value of the activities on the hypergraph. And this is just one example of how that intrinsic connection exists. When you mint an L0 token, you require DAG to do that. That means that those tokens, as they increase in value, that value sort of feeds back down into the DAG that's been locked up. So DAG is, by a sort of implication, becoming more and more valuable. How much more valuable? It's hard to say. I'll say that it's not a one-to-one mapping, which is an isomorphism. Like, it's not like for every 1 unit of value that an LO token increases, DAG increases in 1 unit of value. It doesn't work like that. It's what I would call an exotic isomorphism. There is a mapping, but the exact nature of the mapping is highly dependent upon what those LO tokens are being used for. So let's say, for example, that I were to start a social network on DAG, and I minted a load of tokens that were used by users to reward and pay each other for various activities. All of that labor starts to, the tokens, the LO tokens that I've minted there, start to ingest the value and become a metric for all of that value that is being generated for users on that network. That all propagates into the DAG tokens that I've used to mint those LO tokens. So all of these activities imply the value of the hypergraph. And so it means that DAG in principle is a much better construction for capturing value. As a utility token, it actually captures all that value, unlike, say, ETH, which sort of doesn't, which operates relatively independently of those activities. So something to mention here is the dynamically adjusted validator rewards. Basically, all you need to know here is that the tokens are rewarded to validators in the hypergraph in a way that reflects their contribution to the hypergraph. And because the hypergraph is dynamic in nature and is dependent upon how much computational resources a validator is giving, that the validator rewards have to be adjustable and basically properly reflect the contributions of nodes, of devices to the hypergraph. So basically, that is to say, utility-based currency must track the utility that the network is providing. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a very good way of incentivizing behavior, because it would be arbitrary if it didn't properly track who was contributing what and what value they were lending. it would be arbitrary. And so DAG accurately reflects that. I won't go into how it does that because it's very, very complex, but it basically is a meritocratic currency. It rewards participants and validators in adequate measure to what they're contributing. So in terms of the Constellation model of generative economics, I want to dive into this a bit deeper. Okay, so generative economies define utility in terms of bits per second. So why did they take this approach in DAG? Well, first they recognize that data is a currency in and of itself, right? So data itself is valuable, okay? And this is what all these big consumer applications have recognized a long time ago, that all of their users produce data in the form of their preferences and their likes and their commentary and their content. All of that is data and it's all valuable. And basically, in these social networks, the users are the product because all of that data is being harvested and the users think they're using the social network for free, but actually they are the product. And the data that they are producing is valuable to the owners of those platforms. And so DAG recognizes that data itself is a currency, and they basically have made that the guiding precept for their generative economy. One of the ways that they've leveraged this insight is by connecting to legacy data systems and basically mobilizing siloed data. Siloed data, there's huge economic activities associated with that data, insights and analytics, and basically clear analytics enables better decisions to be made, which enables economic growth. And, so that's just one of the ways that they've managed to leverage this insight. But also the reason that they've put data at the center of this generative economic model in DAG is because transactions themselves are really just exchanges of data between agents, okay? So when you go about transacting with any other agent in your economy, you're actually exchanging data in a sense, right? When you buy a product or a service, you're getting something that is composed or constituted of data, and you're giving money for that. It could be fiat currency. That fiat currency, again, is just data. It's a certain amount of units. You're probably doing it digitally and you're just sending that to the other agent. What that fundamentally is an exchange of data between two agents, okay? And an economy and the growth of an economy and the value of it is really a function of the number of utility generating transactions, i.e. exchanges of data between agents. Now, what DAG have done is basically made transactions feeless. The base case, the default situation of the hypergraph is that transactions are feeless. They don't cost anything, right? Exchanges of information, whatever form they take, don't cost anything in the hypergraph. And so that is a really good position, in my opinion, because if you start to charge agents per transaction, which is what the traditional blockchains do, they charge transaction fees, you limit the amount of economic activity that takes place on those blockchains, okay? It limits the amount that takes place and therefore limits the total growth of that economy, okay? So what DAG has essentially done is said, you can do transactions by default for free. And if you want greater throughput, or if you want to engage in a greater quantity of transactions, then we will start to meritocratic apportion that. We will basically apportion you a certain quantity of the total throughput if you pay or if you contribute resources to the network. And so there's low barriers to entry because it's initially feeless for everyone. And then if you want a greater portion, then you can contribute and get access to that greater portion. So that's another way in which data has sort of been placed at the center of this generative economy. To get into the weeds a little bit more here, DAG is actually defined as information gained or lost per second, okay? And this gets very deep and complex, so we won't go into it in this video, but information is really the inverse of entropy. Entropy is the way that systems move towards thermodynamic equilibrium. That's actually a measure of information because information is negentropic, or information is sort of structure and order, and entropy is the opposite of order. So they have a way of essentially measuring the flow of information through using normalized entropy and also this eigentrust thing. And it gets very complicated. I don't think we need to go into that. But basically, that's how they sort of measure the flows of data around the place and how they decide how much rewards to apportion to the various nodes and validators that are operating on the network. So to think a bit further about why data is so central to Dag's generative economy, it's worth thinking about how and why data is valuable and the importance of being able to communicate data. We've already covered how data has this representational capacity and it can represent virtually anything, the physical world or money, cryptocurrencies, biometric data, and so on. It has this representational capacity, but if data can't be transmitted and communicated, then what is its value, right? It doesn't have much value. This is important to understand about really any good or resource. It must be transmissible to another agent in order for it to be of value, okay? This is generally true about all economic goods and resources, but we don't think about it. We take it for granted. And only when we think about it do we realize that it's true. So one thought experiment here, it's not even a hypothetical, but just imagine that you're this guy who has, hundreds of millions of Bitcoin that have been locked into this iron key wallet. And this iron key wallet basically will, if you enter the password incorrectly too many times, will permanently encrypt and basically be irretrievable. What is that Bitcoin worth if it becomes irretrievable? It's a bit of a trick question. It's not worth anything because nobody's going to pay you anything for that Bitcoin because it's not accessible to them, right? So the upshot there is that currencies, goods, services, whatever they are, they must be transmissible in order for them to be valuable. And that's really another aspect here of why DAG has data at the center. The ability to transmit data is intrinsically connected to the value of the thing being denominated, and that DAG represents that ability, right? And basically, as more value enters the hypergraph, DAG correspondingly becomes more valuable because there's more and more value that's capable of being transmitted. DAG is fungible with that value because it's this L0 fungible layer, interoperable layer, what they call the global liquidity pool. DAG is essentially fungible because it represents the transmissibility of all of this other value on the hypergraph. Right? It is the actualization of that potential. And so it's really quite, one way to understand it is that it's quite like money. Here I've said the metric is money. Like money really represents the ability to acquire goods and services. So it's a proxy for them, right? So if you've got $1 million, that $1 million represents all sorts of things to you. You can buy a house, you can buy a car, you can go on holidays. That's why it's of value. And here DAG basically is the same thing, but in the hypergraph context. It represents that ability to communicate value around the place to end users, consumers, companies, economic agents, and so on. One thing to note in the hypergraph context is that they talk about how in a traditional economic transaction, when you exchange money for a good or service, you don't always have a payload of data. You're just giving them like some euro and they're giving you the thing. But in a hypergraph context, you can include a payload of information that can actually increase the value of that transaction. So for instance, you might be paying for a load of streaming video services on the hypergraph, right? You're watching movies and things. And instead of, say, the platform taking that data from you, you can actually record your activities and sell it off to companies that want to market things to you. So you become what they call a datapreneur. And you basically start to productize yourself and sell your own data about yourself to people who want to sell you back things. So there's this sort of greater potential. It enables these richer representations. So one further thing to talk about in this context is the sinks. So sinks in the hypergraph, which are mentioned repeatedly in the white paper, are essentially ways in which DAG tokens are locked up or used or integrated into applications on the hypergraph that basically takes them out of circulation, more or less. And so it reduces the amount of DAG that is available, but also, as we discussed before, the DAG that is implicated in these applications starts to grow in value as the applications grow in value. That's, related to this whole idea of token velocity. Like currencies that have high velocity change hands more often between agents, and that means that they acquire value at a lower rate because they're constantly being sold and traded. Whereas tokens with less token velocity tend to be of greater value because they aren't exchanged so often. That means that they aren't so available. That means that economic agents will tend to pay more for them because they're scarce. And so the potential for sinks in DAG is much greater because they require you, if you want to mint tokens on the hypergraph, you've got to stake DAG to do that. So you could view this sort of as analogous to like investing in a company, right? Where when you invest, if you're a VC and you invest money into a company, that capital is used by the founders to hire people and to purchase servers and things like that. When those founders spend that money, it's gone. Okay, so it means that, they may have hired a new team, but then they had to pay that team and all that money is gone. But here, when you sync DAG, it's actually recursive. It means that like that DAG, it doesn't dissipate. It actually maintains its position in the hypergraph. It continues to stake out that bandwidth on the hypergraph. So you've got this sort of recursive increase in value as the applications get more and more valuable. The DAG doesn't dissipate, it stays there, and yet it continues to be that which makes the applications possible. And so it continues, in theory, to get more and more valuable as the economic activity increases in the associated application. So let's talk about L0. L0 is this, this layer that exists below layer 1. Layer 1 exists below layer 2. And basically it interconnects all of the layer 1s. Because DAG uses data, it can model all of these public blockchains through their open APIs and essentially provide a representation of the state of those blockchains, right? And that is as good as operating through those blockchains. Okay, it essentially enables you to do anything you would do in those blockchains, but in the hypergraph context through the Java virtual machine, the hypergraph JVM. You have liquidity staked in the hypergraph. When people start staking tokens, you can basically engage in all the trading in these other tokens that you would, except you can do it in DAG, which is instantaneous and feeless and allows for a more complex logic in it than something like the EVM. In the hypergraph, you essentially have this global liquidity pool where you can conduct instantaneous feeless transactions all in this context. And my argument or my belief here is that what you have is effectively something that bypasses all of these other layer 1s, right? Like, why would you go and pay for computations on the Ethereum virtual machine, right? Which is the case where you've got to pay per computation on the Ethereum network. Why would you do that when you can do all of that same logic on the hypergraph for free, and you can have more complex and sophisticated trade strategies? Why not just you do that via the ETH that is staked in the global liquidity pool on the hypergraph, right? And so my argument is that for a rational actor, it only makes sense to do that on the hypergraph because it's cheaper, right? And you want to lower your costs as a rational actor. Over a sufficiently long time horizon, you basically destroy the utility of the EVM because rational agents are going to migrate onto the lower cost option. So I think that's a very thing about L0 that makes it very interesting. So let's talk a bit about how the hypergraph is positive sum. Altif Brown, one of the founders of DAG, talked about how the hypergraph is a bit like a potluck. So he's talking about like a potluck dinner party where everyone brings their own dish, thus increases the variety and the options for the people at the dinner party. If you compare that to like a normal dinner party where there's a finite amount of cuisine or food that's been cooked, and basically people are all competing. It's a pretty bad dinner party if this is the case, but you've got finite resources, a finite amount of food. But when everyone brings their own food, you increase the total that's available for everyone. And so that's how the hypergraph works. Every device contributes compute and resources to the hypergraph. And so what that means is you sort of collapse the bicameral structure of a traditional blockchain protocol where you've got miners and then you've got users. And users are basically relying on the miners to secure the ledger for them. the miners get the vast majority of wealth, or they could be stakers in a proof of stake protocol. They get the vast majority of wealth, and the users all sort of like piggyback on top of that. You know, they may pay the miners transaction fees, but basically in that context, the miners and the stakers are like the cooks and everyone else is the freeloading guests. But in the hypergraph context, everyone is contributing to the hypergraph. So the sum of the hypergraph's computational power increases, right? And that's really an incredible thing because it basically rids it of that bicameral structure, which is really the inroad for the parasitic type of economy, because you have basically people who are freeloading, whereas this is a more egalitarian type of structure and a more horizontal structure. And it basically, because of everybody's bringing something, this tends to be positive sum economy. The total is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And it basically means that there is a greater total economic output than there would be if you have a consumer class, which is the parasitic class, really. So I want to go down the philosophical rabbit hole a bit here and talk about the generative economy and my interpretation of what this is. And I'm referring to this as the axiological closure of the generative economy. Axiology is the name for the philosophy of value. It's about the nature and logic of value and things that create value. And closure refers to the way that something is self-contained, like it is a closed system, as it were, okay? So the way I understand the generative economy here is that in a traditional economy, what you have is the wealth and capital agglomerating or sort of concentrating in the hands of the few. And why that's bad is that more wealth means a greater comparative ability to control the economy and manipulate it to acquire more wealth. You know, if you have money, it's easy to make money. But this creates a vicious cycle where you then have a lot of people who don't have money and they have no leverage, they have no bargaining power, and they're increasingly disenfranchised. And so they're given maybe some money for their labor and for their resources. Those payments are coming from the owners of the assets, the owners of the vast majority of wealth. So as those wages are paid, that just implies the value of the wealth that the owners have, and that is the cornerstone of their economic relationship with the wage earners. And so as the economy grows, the value of the assets, it gets greater, which means that it's harder and harder for those earning wages to acquire those assets. And you have basically a bifurcation where the assets continue to get more and more valuable and the money becomes hard, you know, the money basically is relatively depreciated. You know, the money is not an effectual means of acquiring the assets. And so this is basically the architecture of extraction, where you've got owners who are basically rent seekers and who are using their power and control of the economy and its finite resources to extract wealth and money and labor out of the wage earners. So generative economies eschew this bicameral structure, because basically what you have is co-ownership of the economy itself. Rather than having limited assets held by a few that appreciate at the expense of the holdings of others, everyone has an opportunity to own the infrastructure of the economy, the assets, the wealth-generating structures. And this is key. They have their wealth denominated in terms of those assets. Okay? That's the key part, right? You don't have this bifurcation between the sort of assets, the wealth in the assets, and the units, the representation of the wealth. The entire economy is sort of encapsulated in a currency that is the assets in the economy itself, okay? So by having this universal currency, you to some extent collapse the distinction between the assets and the money that represents wealth, that is a mere representation of wealth. So that's what DAG is, right? DAG is a fundamental wealth structure. It's not a mere monetary representation. It is essential to the operation of the hypergraph. It represents some portion of the throughput, right? And it can't be inflated, right? There's a finite amount. And as the economy grows and gets more valuable, so does that DAG. Okay, so it's like the asset, you have an asset, and that asset will continue to grow and grow and get more valuable as the economy grows. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that the value of the activities on the hypergraph is actually folded into the currency. The DAG implicitly represents the conditions of existence for all of that economic activity. It is what enables it to happen. Okay, and the beautiful thing here is that there is no comparator to the hypergraph. It is a very unique technology. There's no other technology out there like it, as far as I'm aware. And I think I would be aware, given how deep down the rabbit hole I've gone into crypto at this stage. So you have something that is unique, right, in terms of the possibilities that it enables, the potential activities, the potential technologies and applications that can be built on top of this. And you have a direct stake, a direct ownership of the hypergraph when you own DAG. So this is all priced into the DAG currency. So let's take an example, maybe to concretize it a bit. So imagine that the Air Force basically, let's say hypothetically, the Air Force decides to use the hypergraph to conduct its joint domain air command and control operations, right? This isn't a hypothetical, this is actually in the works, right? So what is that worth? Right? What is the national security, the military infrastructure of the Air Force and the United States national security worth? Well, I would say it's worth a lot, right? When you own DAG, you own part of that, right? DAG captures the value of that because the Air Force needs DAG. They need that currency in order to conduct that activity. So DAG is implicitly a representation of having some stake in the ownership of that, okay? So I think that's very profound. I think that's super interesting, okay? So that's sort of like where I'm coming from with this idea of axiological closure, right? Because we're talking about closure because the economy maps to every point of itself, right? Including the DAG currency. And so every point of it grows as the economy grows, as the value of the economy grows. So if you own one of those points, if you own part of that DAG, you own part of that economy. And so as that economy grows, you get to participate in that growth and you are rewarded as part owner of the hypergraph. So let's use another example here just to sort of hammer home the idea. So imagine an island. Okay, there's limited land, it's bounded by the ocean, and you have a load of farmers inhabiting this island, and the farmers all basically decide that they're going to run banana plantations, okay? And imagine that they're running these banana plantations and they start to do well and they sell their bananas to, people overseas, and they start to generate a handsome profit. And so they're sitting pretty and they're like, wow, this island is pretty kick-ass because we can grow loads of bananas and we can eat the bananas, but we can also trade them and sell them to, people who like bananas. But now imagine one of those farmers starts to think a bit differently and says, you know what, I'm going to try using this land for something else. And he starts growing cannabis. And the land, it turns out, is great for growing cannabis because it's sort of nutrient rich for cannabis, and the bananas have sort of instilled some sort of mineral in there. So he starts to grow cannabis, and cannabis is a cash crop, and he starts to make loads of money. And because he's the only guy on the island, he can sell it to the other banana farmers who want to smoke a joint at the end of the day after harvesting the bananas. And so he has, he's doing something unique, and so he gets rewarded even more. Okay, he also, sells that cannabis overseas as well, in violation of whatever drug trafficking laws may apply. But so here what you have is not only is that farmer who's growing cannabis now benefiting, but actually, all of the land on the island then must be reevaluated and have the potential for cannabis growth priced into that land. Okay, so all of the land on the island is now more valuable because they see, wait a second, this land can be used to grow cannabis. It's more valuable than we thought. Okay, so what you have is a sort of increase in the total value of the land on the island. Now imagine that there's another farmer who basically is digging away, trying to, plant some banana trees in his land, and he discovers a vein of gold, okay, under his farm, and he starts to mine it, and he basically earns loads of money from selling that gold. Well, again, Now all of the land on the island starts to look a lot more valuable because you've got the potential value of gold, there being gold there. So the prospecting value of that land increases. Okay, so again, the whole island, the land on the whole island starts to increase in value. So you can see that every time something new and interesting and productive happens using the land on this island, all of it becomes more valuable. Well, that's exactly what the hypergraph is like. Dag, Constellation Dag's hypergraph is like the land on this island. The difference is that as the land grows more valuable, there still remains a finite amount of the land. It doesn't grow, but the hypergraph grows as more people joins it, but that doesn't diminish the value of the land. It actually increases the throughput and the capacity of the hypergraph. Okay. Not only that, but more information is being generated, right? And remember the importance of data. More information begets more information. It's not a finite resource in the way that land would be. In fact, if you can make more interesting combinations of that information, you basically have new products, you have new services. So that is a generative economy. That is what we're talking about here. You have the potential, anytime you produce a new and interesting product of data, all of that starts to be priced in and increase the value of the hypergraph. So it's a very interesting type of economic model. Okay. One of the things here it reminds me of is like generative grammars, and generative grammars are essentially a sort of set of syntactical, grammatical rules out of which you produce an entire language. Like that whole language is basically compressible into that set of grammatical rules, right? And there's a closure there, right? And essentially that is sort of like this generative economy, because there's a sort of a set of rules, a domain, and you're producing information like language out of these rules, the hypergraph, and it is closure, right? There's this sort of informational closure. So all of the value that's generated stays within that context, just like a language. When you produce it from a generative grammar, it's all out of those rules. You're producing that language exclusively out of those rules, and every string in the language is attributable to those rules. So that's just an analogy maybe to think of it, to help think of it more clearly. So something else to talk about here is economic activity is a function of connectivity to other agents. So the more agents you can communicate with, the more potential for economic relationships you have. Therefore, the more potential for generating greater wealth you have is. And that's why interestingly in the white paper talks about how this is sort of similar to a brain. Like in a brain, your neuronal connections are sort of the source of your creativity, I guess. So more connections means more value here. And in the hypergraph, as more agents join, you've got an increase in the total value and the potential for value in the hypergraph. And so the hypergraph captures all of that. I'll talk briefly about this way that they refer to it as an index token. Essentially, that's just saying what I've just explained, which is that the token captures the value of all of the activities that take place. The hypergraph, like the NASDAQ, is a representation of the big stocks in a stock market. DAG is an index token because it represents the value of all the activities, but it's different because unlike stocks, it's not a passive instrument. It's actively necessary to those activities, right? It's leveraged in those activities, and therefore I think it's much more valuable because a stock is only ever a passive representation, but a DAG is like a tool, and so it is much more important to the activities of these companies and therefore in principle more valuable. And so let's talk briefly about state channel businesses. And basically state channel businesses are businesses that are built on the hypergraph using state channels, which I explained in a previous video. And state channels are, these sort of sub-networks on the hypergraph. And the interesting thing about the hypergraph is that it enables more complex tokenomics to be built into these businesses, right? So you can define your own consensus models. You can define the way that agents in your application interact and how they're rewarded and how the incentives work. That means that you've got a much richer variety of businesses and therefore, in principle, greater total economic activity that can happen on the hypergraph than in other contexts. And so that's really what's interesting about the state channel businesses. So that's pretty much everything I have to say about the generative economics in the hypergraph. I think it's super interesting, super interesting. And I hope that you found what I said interesting and that you enjoyed the video. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, I hope to see you in one of our talks. And yeah, thanks. That's all from me. This is Bob on the blockchain.